remote control outlet thing. All right, so let's look at chapter 7 of Ecclesiastes. And again, this 14 through 29 of this chapter, and I said this last week, really, I think you have to include chapter 8, verse 1. So verses 14 through the end of the chapter, including chapter 8, verse 1. Of course, chapter breaks are not in the original, whether you're talking New Testament or Old Testament. So you have to bear that in mind. And sometimes they're, I dare say, most of the time, they're pretty good. But sometimes you get to a chapter break and you just kind of go, I don't know if that's the best spot to separate the chapter there. But anyway, be that as it may, we were talking about this section, breaking down this section of balance as verses 14 through 18, showing our lack of control. But nothing I do or say is going to give me control over my life. Verses 19 through 22, showing our weakness, our own human weakness and frailty. Verses 23 through 29 is dealing with showing our need for wisdom. But that verse 22 where we left off is in that section of showing our weakness, and especially verses 20 through 22 where he talks about, how does he say it in the King James here, verse 20? Verse 20 mentions there's not a just man upon earth that doeth good and sinneth not. And 21 and 22 is especially what I was thinking. Also, take no heed unto all words that are spoken, lest thou hear thy servant curse thee. For oftentimes also thine own heart knoweth that thou thyself likewise hast cursed others. So it's the idea of, as mentioned this last week, don't get, sometimes we get so bent out of shape if we hear something and something, words are said. Sometimes it might even be, there's a situation where, I can think about a situation where somebody might be, eavesdropping. You might be eavesdropping and hear something and get all bent out of shape. Are there not times when maybe I've spoken to someone in confidence and expected that to stay in confidence? And that's, again, said it last week, it's not to try to justify gossip or slander. That's not my intent. That's not the intent of the text. But we sometimes, I think this is where we have to be careful. We can get kind of on I don't know, I'm trying to think, is it the right phrase I'm looking for? Like a high horse. That's how we sometimes used to say that growing up, or I heard it a lot growing up. Somebody gets on kind of this moral high horse, and it's that idea you're looking down on others. Can't believe they said that. Can't believe when, they're talking all those things about me when, if I'm honest, I've done that before as well. Doesn't make it okay for me, doesn't make it okay for them, doesn't make it okay for either one or anybody else. But it's understanding our own weaknesses as humans and even more, narrowing it down even more, my weaknesses as I'm thinking about this. But thinking about, listening in on a conversation you really not intended to listen in on it. This happened to me years ago. I was living up in Illinois, and I listened in on a conversation that I shouldn't have. It was not my business, and I just say it, I was eavesdropping. And so a few days later, I was ranting. Man, I was letting it all out, venting all that to a friend of mine in the congregation. And I was, I'd have been about 20, maybe 21 at the time, living up St. Louis area. And so I was single, he was single, and we'd gotten to be good buddies. And I was just, we were driving, actually driving into St. Louis, and boy, I was fired up. And when I got done, And it was like he patiently waited. And it's just funny to me because it was some real wisdom that I would not necessarily have expected from this fellow. Not that I thought he was foolish, but I got done with my just raging. And I was like, kind of, can you believe that? And finally I took a breath, and he said, well, let me say this. First thought that comes to my mind is, if you don't want to know, don't listen. But if you're going to listen, understand, yeah, you're going to hear something that you don't like. That's any time. There are times that you might listen in on something and you might hear something good. But it's inevitable. And so he said, hey, what he was saying in so many words, it was a lot of wisdom, because he said it in a very tactful way that it didn't come across this way, but in hindsight down the road a little bit and reflecting on it, what he's saying to me is, buddy, I'm not justifying what these folks or what this particular person said about you, but it's kind of on you too, because you eavesdropped. You did something you shouldn't have done. And I had to admit, yeah, that's right. And it kind of, I remember it very well, even though it's been that long ago. I remember it because it just sort of disarmed me. I was angry and fussing, and I was expecting him to be like, yeah, I can't believe that. And, it's just going to get me going even more. And what are we going to do about this and that kind of thing? And it was just sort of completely disarmed me, and it taught me a very important lesson. So, again, words have been said in a lot of different contexts, and sometimes I just need to let it go. It may not even be that I'm eavesdropping. It may be that I walk by. There was a situation one time where I was talking to somebody in a business context, and I was talking about an employee. We were having some issues, and he came to me later, and he said, hey, I want, can I talk to you? I said, sure. He said, I just want to tell you, first of all, I'll tell you straight up, I was not eavesdropping. However, I walked by so-and-so's office a while ago, and I couldn't help but hear some of your conversation. And he said, I'll also be honest enough to say, when I heard my name, yeah, I stopped and listened for a bit and probably shouldn't have done that. So I guess as much as anything, I'm confessing that to you. But also, and we talked about some of that. And that's about as good a way to handle that as you can, because there are some times that maybe you come up on a conversation or you're not intending to hear something, you're not intending to see something, but you do. And, how many of us have sent a text to the wrong person before? That can be really awkward, right? I sent an email one time when I was still a student at UA, working a co-op down in Montgomery, and I was having trouble there were two guys in our department that they kind of tended to drag their feet sometimes. Just a fact. And they sometimes just didn't get on the ball with stuff, and I was having an issue with one of the higher ups, VP or somebody, computer, a program, something for their entire department, and I could not get a solution on this. And I had found out it was a programming issue. It wasn't for we were on kind of the networking, troubleshooting side. It was more of a programming issue. So I forwarded it to those two guys, and I'm still waiting. And I'm getting pushback from the VP who's over that particular area. What's the holdup on this? I got customers that are waiting. We got to get this done. And so I finally forwarded that to my supervisor. And I said, hey, here's the deal. I'm waiting on these two people, Bobby and Ashley. And I said, I'm waiting on them, and I don't know what to do because I'm getting all these questions. It's something they've got to fix. I said, but you know how they can be. So can you help me out here? You know what he did? I mean, if you work in business, you know what he did. He turned around and hit that little forward button. And he typed in, we had the Microsoft Exchange server and all that, and you just you got the departments. He sent it to the entire department. Bobby and Ashley worked over at, this is in Montgomery, Ream Manufacturing. They worked at the Bell Road location, which is where all the VP and the programming and all these different VPs of the company were, and a lot of some other stuff as well over there. Well, once, maybe twice a week, if you were a co-op student, you had to go over to Bell Road and work, and you would work the help desk, which I usually didn't mind. It was pretty fun, laid-back environment, and sometimes I liked it better than having to work over at the other place, because at the other place you're at the factory, and sometimes you got to go out in the factory and fix something, and you get nasty. And so, but Bobby and Ashley are at Bell Road. Guess where Chad was when Mr. Perry forwarded that email to the entire department? I was sitting at the help desk, and it was about from me to Jimmy right there sits Bobby, and Ashley's right over here. And so I'm sitting there, and I mean, within 5 minutes of me sending that to my supervisor, I hear the little notification noise. I look, I got an email. I see it's from Perry. I see the forward. And I was like, no. Well, I opened it up, yes. And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, oh, no. And sure enough, in just a little bit, Bobby says, well, no, how are Bobby and Ashley, Chad? What does that mean? You know how they are. How are we? And I started kind of hem-hawing, and finally, of course, I got frustrated after a little bit, and I said, look, y'all, I'm trying to get this problem fixed. And I've told y'all, and it needs to get done. It's out of my hands. I can't do anything about it, so I apologize. I'm not trying to be ugly to y'all, but what I am trying to do is get this fixed and get this guy off my back. But again, you know what I mean. There are times when you're just going to hear something, and so the wise man here, the teacher, the preacher says, sometimes just let it go, man. Don't get so worked up by it. And to their credit, they kind of laughed it off a little bit later, and it wasn't that big a deal. But it sure made me nervous in that moment, just because it wasn't like I was afraid they were going to beat me up or anything, but I like those guys. But sometimes they would drag their feet a little bit on things like that. And I don't want anybody, especially somebody that you got to work with on a regular basis. I don't want them just, really, I can't stand that guy. So sometimes just overlook it and move on. But also, I think this one brother pointed out that sometimes we need to stop pretending about ourselves, because that's kind of seems to be a lot of the emphasis here is we can, if we're not careful, act like we've never done wrong. And like I've never made that same mistake. And again, that moral high horse in that sense, sometimes I just need to realize my weakness. We can be tempted to act like, I cannot believe this. It could be a family member, it could be a brother, that they messed up. And it's not to overlook sin, it's not to minimize sin, but especially when somebody is trying to make something right and to do the right thing, let's realize our own weakness too and say, you know what? Hey, I maybe a situation where I need to offer that forgiveness as being sought and say, you know what? I forgive you for that. Believe me, I've messed up. I had somebody tell me that one time. I had messed up, and this might have been high school or right after. And somebody I was talking to, it wasn't a preacher. I think it was just a brother, might have been at camp or something, and said, hey, look, let that go. You've sought forgiveness for it. Let it go. Learn from it. Move on. But don't feel weird around me, man. I've messed up too. I've got plenty in my life that I'm ashamed of, and I'm thankful to be forgiven. So let's just move forward together. And that's what we did. So, there's a balance, not just overlooking sin, but realizing that everybody has sinned, everybody needs a Savior. And that's Paul's point in Romans 3:23. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And so may we never just turn a blind eye to sin, but let's make sure we keep things in perspective and recognize our own weakness. Now, 23 through 29 is this next section here, and this is the showing our need for wisdom. And again, going into chapter 8, verse 1. Let's see. He says, I'm reading here from the King James. I got the others on the screen here. All this have I proved by wisdom. I said I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which is far off and exceeding deep, who can find it out? I applied mine heart to know and to search and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things, and to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. And I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and her hands as bands. Whoso pleaseth God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be taken by her. Behold, this have I found, saith the preacher, counting one by one to find out the account, which yet my soul seeketh, but I find not. One man among 1,000 have I found, but a woman among all those have I not found. Lo, this only have I found, that God hath made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions. Who is as the wise man? That's chapter 8, verse 1. Who is as the wise man, and knoweth the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom maketh his face to shine, and the boldness of his face shall be changed. Again, some of these passages are difficult in understanding exactly what he's talking about, but it seems here that what he's getting at is showing our need for wisdom. He's saying 23 through 25, all this if I prove by wisdom, I said I'll be wise. He's going to live the wise, godly, the way of wisdom, that type of life. But he says it was far from me. As for that which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find it out? And so he says he's going to live the wise life, but that's not easy, because that is an endless pursuit. Part of wisdom is realizing how little I know. And we've talked about this before, at least in our Proverbs class, if not in here, that you take just about any field of study, of expertise, or it might even be just something that's kind of like a hobby or whatever. And a lot of times you find out that the ones who know the most are the ones who don't find the need to talk about how much they know about it. The ones who don't go around bragging about how much they know about it. It might be the guy that you say, hey, I'm told that you might, that if I have a question about such and such, you're the person to go to and ask. Well, beware if you say that to somebody and they say, well, you were told right. If that's the response or something like that, I'm going to say, you know what, I think I'm okay. I think I got it figured out. Or I may listen to what that fellow says and it's just going to be kind of take it with a grain of salt. But we've all been there probably where somebody says something to that effect and you say that to that person and they say, well, look, I don't know about that. I know a little bit. I'll help you if I can, but I certainly don't claim to be any kind of expert. A lot of times that's the guy that knows the most. So Solomon is saying here, I'm seeking to live the wise life, but it's not easy because that's just an endless pursuit. And that's an endless pursuit because God's wisdom has no end. There's no measuring, finding out all of the wisdom of God. And so that's just going to be an endless pursuit. He understands that. But at the same time, he's not going to just call off the search. He's going to seek, just like we sometimes say. It's not like any of us, hopefully at least, is foolish enough to believe that we're going to know everything there is to know about everything, or even everything there is to know about. Maybe we're working, laboring in a particular field, a hobby. It's not like we think we're going to get to the point where we know everything there is to know about that even. But do I just throw my hands up and say, well, you know what? I'm just not even going to fool with this anymore. No, we keep going. We say I'm going to get whatever knowledge I can. And if I learn something new, put that into practice. If I learn a better way, put that into practice. And that's sometimes whether you're talking business, church, we can sometimes fall into a rut of how we do things. Of course, we're not dealing with doctrinal matters, obviously, but we can fall into a rut of how we do things to the point that we don't ever step back and say, well, is there a better way? Is there a more expedient way? And sometimes there is. Sometimes we look at something and say, no, well, you know what? This is the same way in business. Sometimes they'll say, hey, we're thinking about doing whatever, making some changes here. And it might be that somebody, maybe it's in one of those meetings, says, that's a disaster waiting to happen. Let me tell you why. They might even say, hey, I know of a company over here. I got a friend at this company over here. They tried that. It was a disaster. Don't recommend it. Might be that they implement it and they realize a little bit later it's not so good, and so they change. But sometimes, if we're willing to take a look at that, and so Solomon says, hey, it's not easy. It's an endless pursuit, but I'm going to keep doing it because that's the best way. So he applied his heart to know, to search, seek out wisdom, the reason of things, to know the wickedness of folly, even foolishness and madness. And then he's going to share some observations from his investigation into the need for wisdom in our lives. And that's kind of what you get into with 26 through 28. And here's, again, you got to take these verses in their context. He's saying, I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. This is interesting to me because I was just reading this recently in Mark's brother's little booklet, The Preacher for Preachers, is that what it's called? I think so. But he made the point here, it's kind of interesting, is there anybody better qualified to write? Of course, we understand Solomon's writing by inspiration, but is there any human on earth at least at that time, if not maybe ever, more qualified to write verse 26 than Solomon, the son of David? I mean, you could almost hear Solomon saying, let me tell you something, and let me tell you something I know, and I can tell you this from my own life, my own mistakes, that he's more bitter than death. This seductress, this woman who would try to lure a man, might be sexual temptation, it might be in any number of ways, but typically involving the sexual temptation, he says her hands are like fetters, like handcuffs, we might say. Her heart is snares and nets. She is going to ensnare you. And he says, he who pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. Or ESV has the sinner is taken by her. Which is, again, interesting to me because Solomon was taken, so to speak, by such a woman, such women. It was not just one, it was many. And so, he says, here's a danger. And we need wisdom to avoid the seduction of the seductive woman, but also just foolish living in general. So he goes on and he says, verse 27, here's what I found, says the preacher. Add one thing to the other to find out the reason, which my soul still seeks, but I cannot find. In other words, kind of this ongoing search. Maybe that he's saying there, again, you can't plumb the depths of God's wisdom, or it may be that the one thing there is a reference to this pursuit of the entire book. What is the meaning of life? What's the true purpose, true meaning of life? I think either way it's applicable. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm confident in saying definitively one way or the other. I think either works, and who knows, could be a little bit of both. But he says, here's what I found, adding one thing to the other to find out the reason, which my soul still seeks, but I cannot find. One man among 1,000 I have found, but a woman among all these I have not found. Now, sometimes I've had people read that or talk about that, and they'll say, man, people talk about Paul as, accuse Paul of being anti-woman, misogynistic or whatever, but look at Solomon here. He says, how's the King James put it? Just lost my spot. But I find not one man among 1,000. Which my soul seeketh, but I find not. One man among 1,000 have I found, but a woman among all those have I not found. It's like, wow, what is his problem? What's he got against women? Well, again, keep it in context. Here's a man that if we're right about Solomon being the human penman here, if we're right about this being toward the end of his life, do you think he realizes he kind of missed it? He messed up big time, wasted a good portion of his life. It's not to say that he's blaming that on somebody else, but I think also, and I think maybe even more so, it seems to me that what he's saying here is, hey, look, it's not easy. This pursuit of wisdom, our need for wisdom, it's an endless pursuit. It's not an easy pursuit. You can't just sit there and say, well, Lord, give me wisdom, and it happens. You can't just say, well, I want wisdom, so I'm going to go out and buy it. The scripture will use that metaphor sometimes, buy the truth and sell it not, but you can't purchase it with money. You can't go through a drive-through or to a store and just pick it up. It's not an easy pursuit. And so what he's kind of getting at here, it seems, is one man among 1,000. How many people really give themselves to pursuing wisdom, to living the godly life? I mean, they take it seriously. Well, there are a lot of people that claim to be. Just like bringing it to today, a lot of people obey the gospel of Christ. Many don't stay faithful. Many they're there, they're present, but sometimes they're not engaged, sometimes they're not active, sometimes they're not seeking, pursuing wisdom. How many, even among Christians? But you expand that out to the world, how many? 1 in 1,000, we say, boy, that's a pretty low number, but I don't know. It's not trying to put a number on it. Just like when you got the parable of the various soils, it's not like God is telling us, hey, you can go and for every 4 people you interact with or try to convert, 1 will become a Christian. You might talk to 8, 12, 16 people and have nobody interested, nobody obey the gospel. And then you might go on a stretch of like 3 out of 4, 6 out of 8 that they do, and they're active and faithful in their Christianity. Jesus is not trying to give us some kind of a formula, and Solomon's not trying to give us some kind of a formula here. It's kind of like in 2 Peter 3. A day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. Some people go to Genesis 1, try to turn that into some kind of divine, eternal conversion formula, and say, well, creation days could have been vast periods of time because, after all, a day with the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. That's not what he's talking about at all. He's just saying God doesn't view time like we do. As though he's saying here, he doesn't mean to say literally 1 among 1,000. That's all you can expect. But he's saying, how many people really pursue wisdom and strive to live that godly, wise life? Not many. And he says, a woman among all these I have not found. Again, I don't think he's for a second trying to say that I've not ever seen any woman trying to do the Lord's will. He had women in his own family. His mother, she wasn't perfect, but every indication is Bathsheba was striving to serve God. There were others that were wives or concubines of David that he would have been familiar with that were godly women. I think it kind of reminds, for me at least, of a couple of verses. Let me get back over here. I always debate if I want to turn to it on this app or just turn to it in my Bible. One of them we know anyways, but there's Proverbs 31:10 is the first one, and that's the one that I dare say we all just about know by heart, because Solomon says there, who can find what? A virtuous woman. And then he says what? Her price is far above rubies. The other one I had in mind was Proverbs Yes, Proverbs 19:14. House and riches are the inheritance of fathers, and a prudent wife is from the Lord. If you have a prudent wife, a wise wife, kind of like he's saying, you better hang on to her. That's like a gift directly from God. And a virtuous woman, who can find? And again, lest we be bothered by that, we talked about this in the introduction of the book. Sometimes people, he's always picturing wickedness as this seductive woman. Well, don't forget, he also pictures wisdom as this godly, wise woman who is beckoning to all to come to follow her ways and be blessed for it. And so it's because, what are some of the biggest temptations for anybody, and any male? But we talked about this in the context of Proverbs just recently. Kings, those in leadership. He gives, Proverbs 30? His mother's giving him instruction, and she warns him, two of the biggest things you better watch out for, my son, are wine and women. Yeah. That's right. It's a warning. And, of course, she's going to go on and talk about some things you need to have as a leader. Compassion and, watching out for the downtrodden. But she warns him against women and wine. And I can't tell you how many times going through preaching school, instructors would say to these preacher training students, I don't think I've ever read anything on preaching. I'm not talking about just a single article. It might be very specific to something. But anything dealing with preaching in a bit more general way that does not say, you better watch out for this. Bobby Liddell, I remember, especially told us, he said, you might think, you might even be thinking to yourself, oh, nobody be attracted to this guy over here. You might even be thinking that of yourself. But he said, I'm telling you, there are wicked people out there, male or female. But he said for the gospel preacher, and any Christian, but just sometimes it seems like, he said especially with a gospel preacher, sometimes it seems like, and he said there have been those women that it's almost like they wanted that as a conquest. And he said, you better watch out. So that's Solomon's idea here. Don't read too much into that, as some people have done, and assume that he's somehow against women or something. He's just saying, hey, it's hard to find a good woman. And we understand that because we use similar language quite frequently. Maybe two women are talking, and they'll say, well, I would like to find somebody to settle down and get married, but all the good ones are taken. And that's frequently said. Well, do they really believe every single good one is taken? No. Sometimes two ladies might be talking, they say, yeah, I'd love to settle down and get married one day, but I'm not going to compromise. Good for you on that. But I'm not going to compromise, and there's just no good ones out there anymore. We'll sometimes say statements like, they don't make things like they used to. And we get that, hyperbole, exaggeration for the sake of emphasis. That's what Solomon's doing here. I believe that's the best explanation there. And so he says, verse 29, this only have I found. God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. And I would just kind of my own paraphrase of that will be, hey, God put us in a position where we can seek wisdom, we can find wisdom, obtain it, maintain it, but just so often we just choose a different path. We just go off because it might be the seductive woman over here luring us off the path. It might be the lure of riches and money luring us off the path, or the lure of fame that calls to us. And instead of staying on that straight and narrow, as we often say, and as Jesus says, Matthew 7, we get distracted and start looking over here and say, let me go check this out. And who's not been in that situation, maybe it's on a hike, you're in the woods or something like that, and there's a path, a designated path, but maybe something distracts you. Maybe you see an animal, you think you see an animal, or maybe you do see an animal and you go, next thing you know, you're off path, and sometimes people end up quite lost that way. And spiritually, sometimes people end up quite lost that way. But God made man upright. By the way, it's not really part of our study here, but it is important to point out, this is a verse that shows us the idea of total hereditary depravity is false. God made man upright. They sought out many schemes. And then, as I mentioned, 8:1 is part of this section, or at least I think it's just, I can't see how it would not be. Who's like a wise man who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the sternness of his face is changed. So in other words, what he's saying here is he's kind of emphasizing the value of wisdom. But again, from those verses we just saw there at the end of chapter 7, wisdom is a complicated thing. And not many people are willing to search for it. It's kind of like, it's kind of like New Year's resolutions. I think we all probably can relate to that. Because sometimes we say, in fact, I've seen some funny little reels on Instagram and places, social media here lately, where, how my new year, new me is going. And that one of them I saw where the guy, he rolls out this yoga mat, and he gets down. It's like these little jump cuts in the video. And next thing you know, he's down on the mat like he's getting in a yoga pose. And then he rolls over on his side like he's doing something. And then it jumps to another cut, and he's got a blanket pulled up over him. And then the next cut, he's snoring. And it was like, this is how my new year, new me is going. We can relate to New Year's resolutions. We start off sometimes with so much promise, and this year is going to be different. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to accomplish that, and it's hard sometimes to stick to that, and that's how it is with wisdom. I mean, and we'll get into a lot of that with chapter 8. In the all of chapter 8 is this idea of entering a new season, a new era, a new year with high hopes, high expectations. You see this with sports teams. This is our year. This is our season. This year, this season, it's going to be different. And sometimes, if you got a team that's struggling, and we've been there. I've seen my teams. In fact, hockey's probably my favorite sport to watch, and my team right now is just awful. And sometimes you feel like it's like year after year you're saying, well, next year. And so I always say I wasn't going to complain if the Blues could ever just win the Stanley Cup, which they did in 2019, but it's kind of been a steady kind of decline since then. But, there are just so many variables. Life is often frustrating. And so even though we start off this new era, whether it's a new year, new job, new season of life, whatever it is, and we say it's going to be different, we got all these high hopes, high expectations, but life is often frustrated, and there's a lot of variables, many things that don't make sense, and it's easy to end up frustrated. And so that's why this brother Kirchville in West Palm Beach calls this section frustrating. Chapters 8 and 9, he calls it frustrated. He's going to look at some of life's frustrations, some lessons, conclusions along with those, and these are going to help us to understand God and His world so that we don't just waste our lives in frustration and sorrow. But back to verse 1 here of chapter 8, it's the value of wisdom, but it's a complicated thing. A lot of folks are not willing to search for it, to seek it. And so it seems that essentially here what he's saying is, wrapping up that section of 7:23 through here in 8:1, it seems that he's saying, hey, it's worth it. It's worth it. Yeah, it's not an easy search sometimes. It's not an easy task to find wisdom, to obtain wisdom, to hang on to it, to increase in wisdom, but it is worth it. And so he's saying, whatever the price, get it. Get the wisdom, whatever it takes. He's going to go on in verses 2 and following to speak about living with wisdom when it comes to authority, government, and he'll talk about frustrated by authorities, frustrated verses 10 through 14, by justice, or lack thereof. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 6, a frustrating end. 9, 11 through 18, a frustrating outcome. Then he's going to deal with handling various points along the way of these two chapters, handling the frustrations of life. But as we close out, I want to go to Proverbs 23:23, because again, I think this is kind of his point there in chapter 8, verse 1. Wisdom is a complicated thing. He's showing the value of living with wisdom. It's a complicated thing, and not a lot of folks are going to do it, but he says it's worth it. And it reminds me very much of Proverbs 23:23, where he says, and since we're wrapping up here, I'll just go to it on the screen as well. He says there, Proverbs 23:23, buy the truth and sell it not. Also wisdom and instruction and understanding. There are some things, he says, whatever the price, be willing to pay it, because it's worth it. Buy the truth and sell it not. Also wisdom and understanding. And so he says, wisdom's worth it, whatever it takes. Get it, keep it, pay that price, because you'll be glad you did. All right, we'll stop there and pick up going into this section, chapters 8 and 9, the rest of chapter 8 and all of chapter 9, which we'll call frustrated, dealing with some of the frustrations in life and what Solomon teaches us about that. Thank y'all very much. We'll have a break before worship.